In the lower register of the Metternich stela, a slab of dark limestone carved in the 4th century BCE, now sitting under glass in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, there is a passage most visitors walk past without stopping. The museum label calls it a healing object, protective inscriptions, standard Egyptian magical formula. That explanation covers 326 lines of the text almost perfectly. But the stele contains over 340 lines. The remaining 14 do not read like a spell. They read like a registry: capacity, known forms, form retained. The label says ritual. The structure says record. The stele was discovered in 1828 in a wall of a Franciscan monastery in Alexandria. It had been repurposed as building material, the face turned inward, the text pressed against mortar for centuries. When it emerged, scholars recognized it immediately as a Sippy of Horus, a category of magical healing object well documented in the late period. You submerged the stele in water. The inscriptions activated. The water became medicine. The sick drank it. That is the function. That is the official reading. And for the vast majority of what is carved on this stone, that reading is stable. The upper register shows Horus as a child standing on 2 crocodiles, gripping serpents in both fists, standard protective iconography. Above his head, the face of the god Bez, another protective figure. Around these central images, dense columns of hieroglyphic text run in tight vertical bands. Invocations, threats against enemies, commands directed at scorpions and snakes. Horus speaks. The spell speaks. The text is in motion, aggressive, pointed at a specific enemy. This is what a healing text looks like. Then the register shifts. Not dramatically, not with a visible break or a blank space or a header marking a new section. The shift is subtle, and that is exactly the problem. The camera, if you are looking for it, catches it in the line length, in the formula density, and most critically, in one small repeated sign that begins appearing at consistent intervals. The healing text stops addressing an enemy. It stops invoking Horus. It stops speaking to the sick person entirely. It turns to face something else. Something that is not in pain, not under threat, not being protected. It begins instead to describe. That should bother you. In Egyptian magical composition, the voice of a text is not accidental. Scribes were trained professionals. Every grammatical choice, every determinative, every shift in register had a reason. The healing invocations on this stele are in second person you, the enemy, the serpent, or in first person, with Horus speaking as himself. That is how healing magic works. It is direct. It is confrontational. It is addressed to a target. The 14-line passage in the lower section is written in third person. About them, descriptively. This is not Horus commanding a serpent. This is someone documenting beings, what they are capable of, what they look like, what form they chose to keep. Not a prayer, not an invocation, a description written for someone who is going to need it. Look at the sign that opens each entry. It is not a standard protective formula marker. In the broader context of Egyptian hieroglyphic composition, it functions as a classifier, a determinative used elsewhere in texts to open categorized entries in organized lists. It is not randomly scattered through this passage. It appears at a consistent interval. One entry, the sign, another entry, the sign, 12 to 14 times. Depending on interpretation of the damaged areas, the same classifier opens each block of text. This is not scribal variation. Scribal variation does not produce a consistent structural pattern across 12 consecutive entries. Scribal variation is irregular. What you are looking at on this stele is a format, and format implies intent. Egyptologists who have worked closely with the text have noted the unusual structure of this section. The authoritative scholarly edition of the Metternich stele, produced in the 20th century, acknowledges that the lower register shows unusual density and compositional features. The section is then classified under the general heading of protective spirit lists, and the analysis moves on. The consistent classifier is not examined as a structural element. The third-person voice is not identified as a departure from the surrounding composition. The passage is absorbed into the category, and the category is never reopened. The record does not deny the anomaly. It categorizes it into harmlessness. Walk through 3 entries in the passage. Each one has the same structure. The classifier sign opens. A name or category term for the being follows not a personal name, not a royal title, not a divine lineage. A category, a type. Then a section describing what the being is capable of, the range of forms available to it, what it can become, and then, shorter than everything before it, a final clause. A closing field, the phrase that records what form it retained. Not what it does, not what threat it poses, not what divine origin it claims. What it looks like right now. If you need to neutralize a demon, you need to know its power and its weakness. Egyptian protective texts know this. They are full of that kind of information. But if you need to recognize a specific kind of being in a physical encounter, you need to know what it looks like when it is not doing anything, when it has already chosen its form, when it is standing in front of you, and you need to know what you are seeing. The final clause in each entry answers that question. That is the retained form field. And there is no healing spell explanation for a retained form field. The official interpretation survives only if you treat that final clause as mythological description. The being appears in the form of X, meaning it is cosmologically associated with X, the way Thoth is associated with the ibis. That reading exists. It is the comfortable one. But it requires the text to be doing something that the rest of the passage's structure resists. Mythological association is described in Egyptian texts using a specific set of verb forms and constructions. The phrase used in the Metternich passage uses a verb form that in other grammatical contexts indicates a completed, chosen, permanent state, not habitual association, a decision, locked. The more grammatically precise reading of this phrase appears in specialized Egyptological grammatical commentary. It does not appear in museum labels. It does not appear in popular translations. It does not appear in the general scholarly literature on the Metternich stele. The distinction between appears as and chose and kept matters enormously for what the passage means. That distinction has been translated flat for 2 centuries. Not suppressed, not destroyed, translated flat. This is the moment most documentary summaries skip. Because once you acknowledge the verb form, you have a problem. The passage is not saying these beings are cosmologically associated with a form. It is saying they had a capacity, a full range of available forms, and they selected one, and they kept it. The shapeshifting is not mythological metaphor for divine power. It is a capability field, listed before the outcome, what they could become, what they chose instead. Not a mythology of transformation, a registry of decisions. Modern cognitive anthropology has spent considerable effort understanding how ancient cultures organized information about entities they believed were real. The research makes one thing consistently clear: structured list-making with consistent categorical fields capacity, available forms. Retained form is a cognitive pattern that emerges when a culture is managing repeated practical interactions with the entities being cataloged, not when it is mythologizing them. Myths about divine beings record origin, power, divine lineage, and cosmic role. Practical identification records note observable characteristics: what the thing looks like, what it can do, what to expect when you encounter it. A modern field biologist's species entry and a modern tracker's animal identification guide share the same basic architecture: category, distinguishing features, known behavioral range, typical presentation. You do not write that kind of entry about something you only think about symbolically. You write it about something you are preparing to see. The Metternich passage follows the tracker's format, not the mythology format. That is a statement about the text's structure. It does not prove these beings existed. It proves that whoever wrote this passage was organizing information about them the way you organize information about things you expect to encounter in the physical world. Modern cognitive science does not confirm the beings. It confirms the mind that wrote this was tracking them, not worshiping them. And then comes the detail that the official story treats as coincidence. Some of the beings described in the Metternich passage appear elsewhere in the Egyptian record, not in other healing texts, not in other protective catalogs, but in Ptolemaic astronomical ceiling registers. These are different objects, different contexts, different purposes. Astronomical ceiling texts track cosmic phenomena, celestial cycles, and the entities associated with them. They are not healing documents. They are observational records. The same beings from the Metternich passage appear in those astronomical registers, written in the same third-person descriptive voice, with the same emphasis on observable, retained physical form. If both texts are mythology, there is no obvious reason for both contexts to prioritize what these beings look like right now. Mythology records what things mean. Both of these texts record what things look like. The overlap between the Metternich passage and certain Ptolemaic astronomical entity descriptions has been noted in Egyptological literature. The explanation offered is genre-borrowing magical texts and astronomical texts share vocabulary, symbols, and entities across the tradition. That is true, but genre borrowing explains shared names and shared cosmological roles. It does not explain why two very different types of documents, separated by centuries and purpose, both use the same practical identification format for the same entities. The archive does not hide this connection. It simply does not follow it. There is a category problem running through all of this. The Egyptian magical text classification is a broad container. It holds healing texts, protective spells, ritual formulas, cosmological descriptions, entity catalogs, and now, apparently, passages whose structural behavior does not match any of these categories cleanly. When material is classified into a pre-existing category, anomalies are automatically treated as variations within the category. They are not examined as challenges to it. The consistent classifier in the Metternich passage is explained as scribal variation. The third-person voice is explained as generic convention. The retained form field is translated flat. The cross-context overlap is explained as borrowing. Each individual explanation sounds plausible. Together, they form a pattern of category management, not conspiracy, not malice, but an institutional tendency to keep unusual material inside existing containers until the container becomes more important than the content. The evidence is not destroyed. It is categorized into harmlessness. Now return to the stele. The same carved limestone, the same lower register, the same dense columns of hieroglyphic text, the same repeated classifier sign opening each entry. You have seen everything that surrounds this passage. The healing invocations, the imagery of Horus crushing serpents, the standard protective formula that occupies 326 lines of this stone. All of that is real. All of that fits the label on the case. And then there are 14 lines that do not fit the label, written in a different voice, structured with a repeating format, describing beings by their capacity for transformation, and then by the form they permanently chose, not invoked, not commanded, documented. The official explanation explains the object. It does not explain this section of the object. To call the Metternich stele purely a healing device, you have to treat the 14-line passage as an irrelevant variation inside the healing text category. You have to treat the consistent classifier as an accident. You have to treat the third-person voice as convention. You have to translate the verb form flat. You have to ignore that the same beings appear with the same descriptive emphasis in a completely different context. You have to do all of these things at once, simultaneously, for the official reading to hold. Each individual move seems defensible. Together, they require a remarkable amount of work to keep 14 lines from mattering. Consider what those 14 lines would have to be if the standard reading is wrong. Not mythology, not cosmological poetry, an identification registry. A formatted document embedded in a medical object, describing beings that could take any form they chose, and recording the specific form each type decided to keep. A document written for someone who expected to need that information, who needed to know not which demon to neutralize, not which divine power to invoke, but which form to look for when the encounter came. Someone in ancient Egypt believed this information was important enough to carve in permanent stone. They embedded it inside a medical object that would be used repeatedly. They used a consistent format so the entries could be read systematically. They used a verb form indicating permanent selection rather than mythological association. They wrote it in third person because the reader was not the patient and was not Horus. The reader was someone else. In a situation where recognizing a specific type of being on site was operationally necessary, the theory does not require supernatural beings to have existed. It requires the people who wrote this to have believed they were recording real information and to have organized that information using the cognitive architecture of practical identification rather than mythological description. And that is harder to dismiss than a myth. The Metternich stele is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Gallery 121, The case label describes it as a healing object, with protective inscriptions. The lower register is described as containing additional magical texts. A visitor reading the label has no indication that one 14-line section of those additional magical texts uses a different grammatical voice, a different structural format, a repeating classifier sign, and a closing field that records the chosen permanent form of beings described as capable of appearing as anything. The classifier is still there, in the stone. The retained form field is still sitting in its position at the close of each entry. The third-person voice still separates this passage from everything written around it. The verb form that specialists read as indicating a completed permanent choice is still carved into the limestone, waiting for a translation that does not flatten it. The beings described here appear in astronomical registers with the same voice and the same emphasis on observable form, and no one in the mainstream literature has followed that connection to its structural conclusion. The stele has been in plain sight for nearly 2 centuries. The passage has been read, the words have been translated, the structural anomaly has been noticed, noted, and set aside. The category absorbed it, the translation softened it, the cross-reference was left uninvestigated. The question is not closed. The question is sitting under glass, carved in dark limestone, labeled protective magical texts, waiting for someone with the right grammatical training and the nerve to ask what a healing spell needed with a registry of the forms that visiting beings chose to keep. The classifier mark is still there. It still opens every entry. It is not damaged. It is complete.